Okay, folks, welcome to House to Education on February 6, 2025. Continuing our journey on Governor Scott's Education Transformation Program. Today, some much anticipated unveiling of some of the plans for the governance restructuring portion of it. We have our usual guests with us today, and we're very happy that you are both here. And we're looking forward to your testimony. Why don't we turn it right over to you and get started?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education, joining you virtually on this snow day. So sorry I'm not with you in person today.
And Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary.
So today we're pleased to share more information around the governance component of the governor's plan. As we've discussed, the governor's proposal is a comprehensive approach that involves changes to funding, governance, and education quality. The purpose of today's testimony is to focus on the governance component. And it's important to note that the governance is designed to support the explicit education quality goals of the funding model. So all of these, again, are inextricably linked as we look at this proposal. We also understand that you're just receiving the materials today and that likely you will have further questions. So we certainly want to be able to orient you to what we've provided today and welcome the opportunity to come back to provide more detail. What should have been uploaded are two documents. One is a presentation that we will walk through, and there's a companion report that goes into much more detail and narrative description around the key components of the governance recommendations. I will share. Does anyone have any questions before I share my screen to walk through the governance recommendations?
No, dive right in.
Great. I'm going to make sure.
We decided that I am no longer in charge of sharing on Zoom because in all of my years here, I've never successfully done it and failed again yesterday. So whereas Zoe's been successful every time.
We're used to using Teams, so sometimes there is that transition when you're using Zoom and going between different platforms.
That was very generous of you.
So today we're going to very briefly go through the current context. I know we've talked about this a lot through our ongoing conversations, and we'll just share that as a bit of a backdrop to understand the rationale for some of these recommendations. We will outline explicitly the principles of the governance changes. We'll walk through some of the detail around the proposal for the 5-district governance model, along with kind of how the school boards would be organized and the central offices and the role of the local advisory councils at the school level. We will have a broader conversation around the education ecosystem, which includes considerations related to choice and the proposal for the oversight and support from the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education.
All right, I'm just going to say to the committee, I think we'll hold questions until the very end. Let you get through the proposal.
Certainly. So the proposed governance model was developed to optimize support. When we're looking at this whole proposal, it's about strengthening our statewide public education system. We've been intentional with this proposal to focus on equity, and specifically equity in terms of budgeting and policy decisions. This proposal also is explicit in fostering local engagement and works intentionally to develop a cohesive education system that is built upon strong public schools. The approach to this work was very much around systems change. We centered all of these recommendations after we focused on what the needs were at the student and school level so that we could have alignment around the entire system supporting the goals for our students and our schools. We are proposing governance changes at the level of the state, district, and school. And this is intended to ensure alignment and, again, build capacity of the whole public education system. We've been very thoughtful in this approach around identifying areas of shared accountability, responsibility, and also ensuring that we have room for creativity within our system. This is a slide that we have looked at several times over the last month, and think it's just important to review this again in centering our work. This proposal is really, as we said, very comprehensive and is designed to strengthen our public education system. We've talked a lot so far about the education funding formula and what's built into that in terms of prioritizing different educational supports and services. We have talked about the fact that that is dependent on our system achieving a certain level of scale. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about what that scale would look like and really the rationale for how we landed on these recommendations around governance. We know for the system to be very effective, we need to improve support and also establish key guardrails at all levels. And we'll talk through those recommendations today. And improving education quality and equity is really central and is a driving force for all of our recommendations. Additionally, we know that part of the approach is ensuring that the system can be sustainable. And we have recognized and had many conversations around the affordability crisis and also the need to future-proof our education system to make sure that we're able as a state to meet the needs of all students. And that means we can ensure that students with similar needs receive similar resources and the kids that need extra support get that. And so this is really intentional in coming back to these key goals as we walk through the governance recommendations today. In the proposal, which as I mentioned, will have further detail, I'll highlight a summary of what we'll go through today. We will walk through the 5-district model. This is eliminating our current supervisory union structure and moving from 119 districts to 5 districts. We'll talk about the composition of the school board, the role of the school advisory council, and also the role of the central offices. We will explain our thinking around the use of an education support agency. This has been, last year and in former conversations has been referred to as a BOCES, and the intentionality here is to increase capacity, coherence, and equitable delivery of support and services. And this is really targeted to key areas of educational delivery in our system. Within this future state, we have identified revised roles for the Agency of Education and the State Board. And the intention here is to really build upon and leverage the expertise of each of these entities at the state level to support and strengthen our overall public education system. We, in this model, we'll talk about, our education ecosystem and really thinking about how we build a strong ecosystem that at its core is based on strong public schools and also fostering the state's long tradition of tuitioning and allowing for choice within the system. So our current context, as we've walked through, is, we've identified that there are many systems challenges. And so a lot of the challenges we face are not due to a lack of effort or commitment by our educators, but that there are some broader system issues. And so we've noted that we have a highly complex board governance structure to serve a relatively small number of students. We have a top-heavy organizational structure, and that can divert resources from where they're needed most in the classroom. We have discussed the challenges of placing the right staff expertise at the right level of our education system. And we know that in certain areas of our state, there are really critical vacancies, or there are areas where we're not able to hire highly qualified teachers. And so part of this work is really thinking about how we build the expertise in the right level. Within our hyperlocal budgeting, we have hyperlocal budgeting now, but it also operates within a statewide education funding system. And we've had a lot of conversations around how that distances the voter from the local education decisions. Across the state, we have great variability in terms of the implementation of education standards and inconsistent expectations and performance outcomes. We've seen this also in terms of persistent gaps when comparing performance with our historically marginalized students. We know over the last 20 years, we've had a significant decline in enrollment, had rising costs, and statewide affordability issues. This has placed incredible pressures on our school. The lack of scale is what we're really going to be focusing on today as we talk about the governance recommendations, because we know that the lack of scale is creating some budget constraints, it's creating competition for funding, and also is inhibiting in many areas a district and school's ability to provide specialized resources for their students. So the impact of these system issues have been well documented and are the reason that we're coming forward with a comprehensive proposal. We have a fragile system where many districts struggle to ensure operational continuity. There's a high cost of operating the school portfolio, and that cost can divert dollars away from students. It limits the ability to address deferred maintenance and capital needs as well. The lack of scale limits opportunities. It does make Vermont's more vulnerable communities and high needs communities subject to shifts in the federal funding. And so, with some uncertainties in the federal funding for education, this is something that we're focusing on and making sure that our state funding is able to appropriately resource our high needs communities to address their needs. In our data, we have seen that the state funding is not meaningfully different for our higher needs communities, and that they tend to rely on federal dollars to meet the additional needs of their students. We have seen an inequity in terms of students' access to a robust course list. We know that certain schools are able to offer a broad range of courses and electives and extracurriculars, and other schools simply are not because of budget constraints. And in the system, we've heard consistently feedback from the ground that there's a real challenge locally in being able to address these issues because they really are statewide systemic issues. And so part of this plan is creating a path forward to really provide the support, the direction to overcoming many of these barriers. So we'll move into the district governance proposal. And as we're talking about the district level, we are describing the role of the school board and also the role of the central offices. The goal would be to achieve scale. And this is designed to reduce administrative burden and increase opportunities for educational leadership, and also being able to bring on board more expertise in specialized areas to support schools. Some of those specialized services that would now be available at the central office would include hires to focus on curriculum and pre-K, facility management, special education, and professional development. Within the funding model, we have noted that there are some assumptions built into that to guarantee that the state is providing funding to support a wide range of educational opportunities, but there's also a lot of flexibility within the model. So the districts would have the opportunity to make adjustments in terms of how they would staff their central office to meet the needs of the district. A central goal and tenet of the larger school districts is to promote equitable decision-making so that we're making decisions for a larger group of communities that have a diverse set of needs. Because what we're seeing in practice across our state is that some of our lowest needs communities, some of our highest needs communities struggle the most to pass their budgets. They're also the communities that tend to have to focus on more and more cuts, which we know limits opportunities for students. And so when we can think more broadly around the needs of a wide range of communities, that's where we as a state and as the district can be more equitable with allocating those resources where they are needed the most. The 5-district model also gets us closer in terms of parity with tax capacity. So within these districts, the property wealth is more similar than in our current construct. And that's important as we consider the ability to pay for the funding, and in any future conversations regarding the ability to raise local share, this would be important to ensuring equal tax capacity. The 5-district model does eliminate the supervisory union structure. Again, moves us from 119 school districts to 5 regional districts. Each of these districts would be governed by an elected part-time board, and they would be operated by 5. Each of them would be operated by a central office. So this would give us a total of 5 school boards and 5 central offices across the state. We have noted in the report that we do have 2 interstate districts, and that there would be considerations around adjustments there. We've noticed some complexity with that work, and also that we would need to contemplate exceptions for out-of-state tuition in remote areas. This is a map that I think we've shown many times. So on the left, you can see our current structure, which has 52 supervisory unions, 119 districts. On the right would be the proposed district model. Within that, you can see that there's relative consistency in terms of enrollment, with the exception of the Champlain Valley being larger. We also have done an analysis in terms of needs, and across these districts, there's relatively similar needs in terms of students that qualify for free and reduced lunch and students receiving special education services, among other indicators. This is a chart that does that breakdown and shows the distribution of average daily membership within these proposed districts, the percent of free and reduced lunch, the percent of students that are English learners, and also looking at the overall grand list for these districts. And so you can see, as we're looking at the demographic characteristics within these regions, that it gets us to greater similarity than we have now across our state. Moving into the role of the central office. The central office is really designed to be much more robust in this model. And so it allows for the district to hire for those specialized roles, to provide more dedicated support. The approach that we are working on is the evidence-based model. This is the formula that's built into that. This chart is based on a district of 3,900 students, and has ratios built into it to assume staffing levels. Larger districts, which we are proposing, would have more staff, and they would be able to staff differently, but we would assume that the overall cost per student would be relatively similar. And so this overall model really is a shift where the central office is able to not only oversee some of the administrative and compliance responsibilities, but has greater capacity to deliver on a lot of the specialized services and resource supports for our schools and for students. Next week, we would like to come back and kind of model for you different choices that districts might make within the budgeting framework around how they might staff their central office and schools, to really think holistically around the available resources and support possible through this proposal. Moving into specifics around the school board, each of the school boards would be elected. We noted that these districts are much larger. Within these larger regions, we would develop voting boundaries or district wards. That would be a partnership with the Secretary of State's office. And the representation, as we're thinking about this, is about 5 school board members per board. Given the size of the Champlain Valley district, there may be reason to add additional board members, but it's important to recognize that the boards would be representative of the kind of smaller geographies within the region. So they would be able to bring in a different perspective across the district. So we've talked a lot so far about the role of the school board and the central office. The scale that is achieved there is really supporting equity, and really helping to pool resources and support for a larger region of schools. But we also know that it's important to create opportunities for that local engagement. This proposal will require every school to have a school advisory committee. And these committees serve very distinct and important roles for the school. They're very different than what you would think of as a parent-teacher association that might, do fundraising for the school or organize events. The school advisory committee has a much more focused and strategic role on really supporting the overall quality of the school. So duties for the school advisory would be providing input on the equitable budgeting parameters that would be part of the education policy. The school advisory would also develop the school improvement plan. The school improvement plan is a requirement of state and federal law and really does drive decision-making and prioritization for each school. Within this model, we are proposing that the school advisory would have advisory role in a discretionary amount of the budget that would be required to set aside for input from the local advisory council. We do have some districts in the state of Vermont that implement a similar practice. And so there are some models that we can build upon that have proven to be really effective and really meaningful in engaging parents, students, staff, and community members in that equitable budgeting decision-making. Representation of the school advisory would include students, parents, caregivers, educators, and community members. So moving into the proposal for the overall education ecosystem, a couple things to note that's very different about this proposal than our current state. So within this proposal, there would not be the process of announcing an annual tuition. That amount would be the same as the base and weight that's part of the overall funding model. Within this approach, we would no longer have non-operating districts. In this model, we would draw attendance zones so that every child would be assigned to a public elementary, middle, and high school. Also within this model would allow for the student and parent to apply for choice of a school choice school, which we will walk through some more of those considerations. One of the key things within this model, and I think the key principles, is that it's built on having strong public schools assigned in your local community while fostering the ability to exercise choice. And what's critical within the framework is having shared accountability. We have in the report identified some considerations for that shared accountability, which are really focused around academic quality and financial viability. As we engage in future conversations around the education policy, we're welcome those further conversations to get more precise and concrete on that. But the critical piece they need to be clear and measurable and not overly burdensome, but really focused on the core drivers of academic success. So the overall enrollment process for a school choice school would be, there would not be an attendance zone, but those would all be managed through a lottery process that would be district-wide. So I'm going to come back to this for a moment. So a school choice school, a little bit different in terms of how we're contemplating this. So in independent, currently we have different designations for our independent schools. There would be one designation for schools that would receive public tuition, which would be a school choice school, and another designation to recognize private schools for the purpose of overseeing truancy and things of that nature that are required for our compliance. Within this model, a district might choose to identify a public school as a school of choice, and all would be part of the same application process and would be held accountable to the shared criteria. I'm going to turn it over to Jill to talk about the Education Services Agency and how we see that fitting in with the overall ability for our state to provide specialized support and services to our schools.
Sure. So I get one slide, which is great. So education service agencies in Vermont, we've been talking about BOCES. They're really sort of one and the same. So how we've been sort of thinking about this whole sort of education ecosystem and really ensuring that we have the right level of support and expertise at the different levels of the governance system. So recognizing the work that was done last year through Act 168, there was a sort of recognized need. There are certain educational supports and delivery of services that really need to be achieved at scale. One of those that I think there's a really broad consensus on is the delivery of special education services and support. So in an effort to address that need within the current context, you all passed Act 168, and that allowed for the creation of BOCES. As we were thinking through this new system, we really wanted to contemplate where might we have a role, similar kind of entity if we're at a different scale. And so just as we've done with all of our proposals, we wanted to go back to what are the goals that we would hope to achieve with this policy proposal. So this slide is really kind of outlining what I think are the principles, and then I think there really is space to be thinking about some potential areas for a BOCES, but also we should think about if we are at a 5-district scale, are there actually services and supports that can be delivered through that scale instead? So there's some questions there. So these are kind of the stated goals and principles that any education service agency or BOCES, however we're going to end up calling it, should build capacity in the education system to deliver key services and support that cannot otherwise be met by districts or the agency of education. And that's sort of what I was just pointing to. If we move to a different scale, where are those gaps or maybe a more effective model? The other thing for me that's been really critical as I've been thinking about this and we've been sort of contemplating this is that an ESA or a BOCES should support increasing coherence across the system. And I think anyone who's heard me in this room before is like, bringing coherence to our system is a critical goal that we need to sort of share. And that's going to require close collaboration and alignment between the Education Service Agency or BOCES and the AOE so that we're limiting mixed messaging or the creation of competing priorities. And so that may necessitate sort of another look at Act 168 to see if that alignment is sort of built in. This model should increase equity through the consistent delivery of high quality services and supports in a small rural state. So how do we ensure that this kind of organization is actually covering more ground and not sort of further fracturing and creating complexity? And critically, we want to think about what are actually those key areas of strategic importance where a statewide or cross-district approach yields specific measurable benefits. So that accountability framework should also include, we're talking about shared responsibility and shared accountability. It should also include a BOCES or an education support agency. So policy considerations obviously would include a potential amendment to Act 168 to align with the proposed governance structure and the principles and goals outlined above. We've already kind of identified, again, I think we have some consensus around the potential use of this model for special education services, but we should revisit if we're looking at a larger governance structure. And then we will be bringing forth our CTE proposal, which also contemplates the creation of a single statewide CTE BOCES. That will be in the next week or two. All right, so I'm going to get back to you.
So moving now into statewide governance, the approach here is to make sure that we're really leveraging the unique expertise of the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education to support the overall system. So the agency has a number of duties that have been specifically enumerated, including serving as a sole state agency to administer federal funds, identifying educational goals for the system, evaluating the performance of our education system, overseeing compliance with all education laws and regulations, be those federal or state laws, administering statewide educational data and reporting, and licensing professional educators. The current role of the State Board of Education, the State Board is comprised of 10 members that are appointed by the governor and include 2 students. Historically, the responsibility for regulation and governance of student attendance records, student performance, approval of independent schools, post-secondary approval, and ensuring equitable access to educational quality. So Vermont's current accountability and responsibility of education is shared between the agency and the state board. For the federal purpose, the AOE is the governmental unit that is responsible for the supervision of elementary and secondary education in the state. And the agency is the single state level entity that is accountable to the federal government for federal programs and requirements. So authority of the agency over certain federally mandated activities is listed by the terms of rules adopted by the State Board of Education related to special ed, student achievement standards and assessment through EQS and CTE. There are significant overlaps in key areas that include vision and goal setting, evaluation of district attainment, student outcomes, and meeting those standards. And so I think there's the overlap really has occurred when the Department of Education transitioned to an agency of education. There was wasn't as much focus on really delineating those roles and responsibilities. And so this is something that the state board has been reviewing over the last several months as well, and the Agency of Education. And so what that's resulted in is an incomplete division of those statutory functions. And so this is an opportunity for us to really align that work in creating that shared responsibility and role clarity, building upon really the unique expertise and assets that each entity brings. So the proposed role of the State Board of Education was really to align that responsibility and accountability in places where it makes sense for that to come from a board, and that oversight would be more effective than having that housed at the Agency of Education. And so we're proposing that to be the appeals process for schools of choice. So currently, the State Board is responsible for approving and renewing independent schools. In this context, that moves to schools of choice, and that could be a private school or a public school that would follow the same application criteria and the same accountability. We are also proposing that the state board would review the board governance components of the district quality standards. In this proposal, we are putting forward an approach for an equity budgeting model that the school board would need to approve. So that would be one other area where the state board would review and provide support, along with developing and maintaining model policies for the school boards. As part of this work, the school boards will really be responsible for a much larger region of schools and a much larger budget. And so with that, it's important that the state can offer additional board training and support to really focus on governance that's around student outcomes governance and focusing really on student results. And so the state board would be able to contract with a training provider to ensure that boards get that support and training in their roles. Also, I would note there are other states that have done a similar model and have found it to be very effective, and that can be a reference point for us as we move forward. So the proposed role of the Agency of Education would be to retain, the current responsibilities, but also to increase support to the field. This approach is really designed to accentuate the agency's ability to really help the field in achieving, expanded educational opportunities and equity and sustainability of the system. And so this would include new supports and more targeted ways to drive continuous improvement in providing resources and data-driven information to the field to help elevate statewide outcomes to achieving our goals. We are proposing new responsibilities through rulemaking, and this is intended to ensure the strong implementation of the new finance, governance, and education quality systems, and to improve district implementation of the education quality standards and the district quality standards, and really creating that alignment between rulemaking and the organization that is responsible for providing that support and oversight in the field to really ensure that continuity and clarity. So I'm going to stop sharing this presentation, but I also want to make sure you have access to the report, and that might be a helpful reference for us as we go through your questions, because in the report itself, there's a lot more detail around kind of the rationale and the thinking for some of these governance changes.
And I also want to signal the appendix of the report has the maps for each of the 5 districts, and we've actually included there the schools in those districts that are coded by like elementary, middle, high, and high school as well. So folks will have that. So they have no questions.
Right. No, we're all set. Thank you very much for coming in.
Would you like me to
let's-
walk through the report so you get would you like me to orient you to the report and kind of the additional specificity within that? Or would you like to start with general questions?
Let's go to questions.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. We've all been thinking a lot about this, and personally, as I look at it, I think to myself, this is includes many of the things many of us have sort of theorized in our heads and talked about, which is easier to talk about in the context of a state that has 0 people, all the property that is normally associated with a school, and you're starting from scratch, as opposed to completely changing around a system that has evolved over 300 years. So that's, I think, one of the real challenges we face. So I'm going to start off with a very basic question. Who decides where every child goes to school? What building they actually attend?
So do you want to talk about feeding patterns? We talk a lot about feeding patterns when we're talking about this.
Yeah. So part of that would be organized within the new district models with support from the leadership of the district and with community input to think about how to organize those strong feeding patterns. So, you're rightly pointing out that within our current state construct, we have certain areas where students are not assigned to a public school. So this is a shift in that, and making sure that the state can guarantee that every child has a public school that they're assigned to while still allowing for choice options. So this would be looking intentionally within the districts around creating those strong feeding patterns from elementary, middle, and high, and really creating zones around those feeding patterns that make sense, depending on your enrollment and depending on some of the demographics of the community and including topography, those feeding patterns might look different. So in some cases, you might have 3 or 4 elementary schools feeding into 1 middle school and 1 high school, and others, it might be 1 elementary into a middle high. And so those are all things that would be part of this planning and the design of the system. There's some thought in terms of the transition plan around the existing boards doing a review using the district quality standards to do an inventory of their current district, and also to be able to identify opportunities for strengthening those feeding patterns. That input would be received by the new boards and supported if supportive of making these decisions around how you organize the feeding patterns effectively. I do want to call out, because we are building this system on top of 200 years of tradition. Likely there will be exceptions that we need to contemplate as we've worked at this proposal. It's really thinking about how to develop this as a statewide system, while also recognizing that there will need to be certain exceptions and flexibilities built into this proposal in order for it to be practical.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to actually repeat my question.
Yeah, please.
So, Colin,
I
and
wish
so,
you would.
as we say, the short answer is the districts are.
The
responsible.
districts.
So the
Yeah, so the state is
Why did-
articulating that every student
Yep.
must be within an attendance zone in which there is a K through 12 public school. So that's the guardrail. And then the districts are responsible for organizing themselves. And we do want to point out, it's not as if feeding patterns don't exist, right? There are feeding patterns when you go from elementary to a middle to a high school. They just tend to be quite small right now because of those 119 districts and the variety of sort of constraints within each of those districts may limit those feeding patterns. But I think that our position is that that would not be a state responsibility, because there is so much local knowledge and input that's needed. But how this is organized in other states is that the districts would organize that. But there are clear guardrails. Every student, and we'll kind of say this again because it's part of the school choice conversation as well. Every student will have access to a K through 12 public school. And I want to call on page 7 is where we articulate this a little bit more.
I guess I just picture, let's say, an expanded Champlain Valley District Board of 7 people deciding where every child goes to school and having to navigate every question of, well, I'm actually a half a mile closer to that high school than that high school or elementary school.
So I think Zoe articulated something though, which is that it wouldn't necessarily be the new boards. And what we were talking about was, Zoe, do you want to repeat that portion of what you said about how these decisions would be made over a period of time?
Yeah, so as part of this overall transition and the current timeline proposed, there's really 2 years of planning that is built into this. And we already have tools in place to really evaluate the overall kind of operational well-being of our districts. So we would use those tools as part of that review process and identifying where there are opportunities. I think to your point, this work is inherently complex. And what I'm hearing is, what are the question really is like, how are we as a state going to be providing support to the districts and local community around kind of those guardrails and best practices? And so that would certainly be part of the process to support this work.
I guess just not to put too fine a point on it, land back to who is making this decision for where each and every child goes to school. Is it the new school board? I think, sort of looking at our 300-year tradition, that's the group that's empowered to do that. So I guess it would be the school board that would make these decisions.
Yes.
Yes.
I actually have an earlier question, I think, prior to the who. I guess I really need clarity that, are you saying in this plan, every student in a district will be assigned to a school, a public school? So I know it's a K-12 system, that the district is a K-12 system. There are multiple schools within each district. I'm saying this and you'll push back if I'm wrong. So my understanding is these large districts will have multiple schools. Every student in there will be assigned to a public school. And then if that statement is correct, the next step would be a lottery system for a number, however many students that that still doesn't seem to be articulated yet, but will have access to a choice system of both independent, independent schools and public. Is that correct?
Yes.
So putting it into the current context. So in the current context, we have certain districts that are non-operating. So with those non-operating, the
Yep, got
students
that.
would be assigned to a public school attendance zone. And then the choice option, so if it's an example that it's an independent school choice, they would have the ability to apply through the lottery, and there would be, to honor the tradition of tuitioning, there would be preferences available for the town in which a student resides for enrollment purposes.
So
And
for clarity,
page
you,
7, Arthur.
I'm on page 7. So I said a school, public school, and you said a school zone, which is two different things, I think. Am I right?
So, let's look at page 7. So,
I'm
and
here.
I realize you're getting this right now, so we're.
Yep,
we're
no,
doing it real
It's
time.
page 7 of the larger.
The
policy
larger
The
document.
report, yes.
Mhm.
So in this plan, school districts must articulate attendance zones, sometimes called feeding patterns, resulting in every child being assigned to a public elementary, middle, and high school. So I think that's the direct answer to your question. And then as
Okay.
you articulated, each school district will also be required to designate at least
Okay.
one school choice school based on state articulated criteria. So there's eligibility criteria that are coming from the state. The districts are going to assign their school choice school. And then, as you did a great job articulating, there will be a lottery process
Okay.
that will allow students access to potentially to a school choice school. We do also, I think as Secretary Saunders pointed out, we do acknowledge the sort of geographical and historical kind of patterns that have existed in some parts of the state. And so the school choice school in that lottery system may have geographic patterns.
I don't want to dominate.
So anything to add to that?
The other thing I would add is in this approach, it's not intended to start from scratch. And so I think that's what the Deputy Secretary was getting at, is that we already have feeding patterns in place. And so a lot of the conversations that we've had in the field are, when you look at these district boundaries, you can think about them as dotted lines, right? And so this is an opportunity to start with your existing districts. Does it make sense for that district to collaborate with the district, its neighboring district, to think about different ways to organize the student pathways from elementary, middle, and high school? And these are, this would be consistent with a lot of what we heard in the Listen and Learn tour, which was a preference for, smaller elementary schools and middle schools that are larger and offer more programming, and then having the consolidated high schools. So this is, it would be not starting from scratch, but starting from your existing districts, and thinking intentionally around how to organize in terms of meeting also some of the quality standards and financial indicators that we're talking about. So in order to be able to deliver a consistent set of educational experiences, we know that there are different choices that would need to be made in the system. Those can be done certainly within a district if it has a really strong feeding pattern, but there's others that may want to coordinate with a neighboring district to think about expanding the way in which their students would progress from elementary, middle, and high school.
Representative Brown.
I just was wondering, can you give us any more information about how you all are thinking about attendance zones? Because I guess I'm still stuck a little bit. Our town tuition program grew out of some school sparsity in significant chunks of our state. So if there does not currently exist a public school in the K-12 system, just how large are these zones contemplated to be? And is there sort of like an initial draft map of kind of what this landscape looks like?
All right. We've lost Secretary.
Oh, shoot.
That's okay. I was like, she's
Share.
very quiet.
No, she's
Yeah.
frozen for a while.
So I think it's that kind of day.
Internet.
People are losing their internet left and right. So we are, again, not starting from scratch in this, because we actually did a lot of mapping. I think it was back in 2012, 2013. There she is.
Yeah.
So we were talking about how do we define attendance zones in areas where there's a lot of geographic distance or sparsity. And so I just started to say that we're not starting from scratch. We do actually have some drive time mapping and some mapping that goes all the way back to the pre-Act 46. But we are thinking about that, absolutely. And Zoe, if you wanted to talk about kind of some of our thinking around this, we're not oblivious to it. It has to be workable.
Yeah, so again, like these are our principles, right? And this is a multi-year plan, and we are building on a system that already exists. So we recognize that there will need to be exceptions, and so we've flagged that, and particularly in more rural parts of our states, there may need to be exceptions to these rules in order to ensure that we're offering students a high quality public education, school choice and school choice, right? And that's kind of the principle here. So as we've described, we've started to do that analysis in terms of looking at commute times and distance in terms of our existing schools, and to really evaluate that feasibility. So we do recognize that there are going to be exceptions to this rule, but as we start to look at the maps, you can see in many areas this is something that would be feasible, and could build upon some of the existing structures we have in place. The other thing I would note to this is over the course of our regional planning through the Listen and Learn tour, we heard from a lot of superintendents and principals who are really actively engaged in this type of thinking, and saying, we'd like to work with our neighboring districts to think about how we would organize ourselves differently, building on, the assets of those communities and the best facilities and things like that. So I think we also in this process would be trusting our leaders on the ground that really understand the communities and have in many parts of our state really actively been working towards this. I often say that this proposal is directionally aligned with a lot of what we've heard in conversation and in planning, and is building a little bit more structure around that. And I think part of the next phase, as we talk about the specifics of the education quality policy, is really getting more concrete around the guardrails and best practices to support our leaders in the field in being able to achieve this.
Okay, I'm gonna need a little clarity on
Yeah.
the school choice, sorry. SCS.
Yes, it's school choice.
School choice
Oh,
schools.
all right, sorry.
SEC,
Okay,
yes.
they would be available in sort of everywhere.
And even across district.
And they could be a public school, they could be an independent school. I can see why it would have to be like that, because you can't not offer the same opportunities for everybody. So we have areas that have traditionally had tuitioning due to a lack of public school. We've had other areas that have been public schools all the way. Does this open the door to folks coming in and creating an independent school in competition with the public school system? So, for example, where I live in Addison County, other than the small exception of Lincoln, we have been a pre-K to 12 system traditionally always. If we are now in a broader region, and that broader region has the concept of school choice schools, as all of them do under this scenario, can somebody come into Addison County, open a large independent school, and say, hey, we're open for business, and now we're in competition with the public school system?
So this proposal is really designed to promote a well-functioning education ecosystem that is able to achieve the balance of strong public local schools and choice options. To that end, there's a process for applying to be a school choice school, and that would follow the same criteria. One thing to note, I think, in this future state is also that we're establishing clear education quality and financial metrics. And as part of that, there may be some public schools that may not be able to achieve that. And there may be some independent schools that may not be able to achieve that. So the key to this whole approach is ensuring that there is shared accountability, that there's clarity around how we're measuring quality, how we're investing public dollars to support education, and that would be happening across the board within this education ecosystem. So practically speaking, it could be, an independent school would apply to be a school choice school. There would be a clear set of criteria established for that process, an identification of the number of spots that school has available to enroll students. It would go through an approval process with the district. There would also be an appeal process available that would go to the State Board of Education in this model. In some parts of our state, there may be an interest for a public school to be a school of choice. And so as we're talking about this, the choice in this context is really describing specialized programs and offerings, and making sure that all of our public schools are resourced to provide a well-rounded and whole child education. That's why we focus so much on the base within this proposal. Is this is about ensuring that every school is able to deliver a core set of electives and programs and resources and whole child support. But we know that some children may be really interested in pursuing a program on aeronautics or something of that nature, and that would be more specialized. And so that's where the choice comes in. Within our existing framework, choice, I think, is often talked about in terms of reassignment. And so reassignment would still be an option to parents. So let's say they would be able to work in another area. If there's space, they could have a reassignment for that school to go from the public school they're zoned to another school. And so that would be built into the processes as well. But the point of this is, as we think about this model and we think about the future of Vermont and being able to have the best education system in the country and increasing enrollment, we're thinking in the long term about making sure that there's a really strong foundation, and that as a state, we can guarantee access to a high quality public school while also fostering choice in kind of specialized programming and options for students to align with their interests.
And
Can I
Rep.
just-
Conlon, can
I just would like, is the answer to my question yes?
the district
Has to approve that.
The district has to approve the school
No.
choice school. That's where the authority for that lies.
School
So
or
the eligibility
attendance?
criteria are established at the state. The district, they will then apply to the district, demonstrate that they've met those criteria. They would also have to sort of identify, like, what is the special programming they're offering. The district would be able to designate their school choice schools, and there is an appeals process up to the state.
So theoretically, possibly yes. I mean, you're not saying that there's nothing to stop a proliferation of private schools throughout the state being designated as school choice schools if they meet the criteria of the district.
If the district approves.
But there's not a criteria that says we got enough seats.
That could be part, yeah. So
That's
those
part
are
of
the
the
details
criteria.
around the application process. So the application process, part of that would be understanding the available spots and seats available.
To clarify, I think, like, we can be more clear. So I think, as Zoe just said, as part of the application process, we would expect that the district would be looking at their sort of portfolio of schools, the number of students available, so that you wouldn't want to approve a school that might drain your own public school system. So that criteria around seats may be one of the criteria for consideration in the eligibility and application process.
So if you think about it in our current
No.
The answer
context,
to your question is,
Wow.
depends on the criteria and the eligibility.
Hands are going up everywhere.
I think that's the answer.
Sitting on
so
them.
I think in our
Uh,
current context, it's kind of considered within the non-operating, right? And so there's an assumption within the non-operating districts around how
Oh,
many
that's-
students are
not-
in those non-operating districts and for enrollment. This is kind of flipping that and thinking about district-wide, what's kind of enrollment capacity, and being intentional around evaluating the opportunity for those choice options as part of the criteria.
I'm gonna go right down the right here and then around. Leanne, you're up.
But you also said that there was an appeals process that then goes to the state if the district doesn't approve that school. So they can appeal.
Would, yeah, just be part of any, there's often processes within the district that if they're not approved, they would move to the state board for appeal. And so
Right, and
what we
you're-
have built,
Running the state board or in your
No.
plan.
no.
Whole separate-
So in
Oh,
the,
okay.
in the plan, the state, the state
boards.
boards, yeah. So the
Yeah,
state
or to
board
the court,
currently,
Policy decision.
Okay.
yeah. So, yeah, currently the state board approves and renews independent schools. And so this would be part of that process, but within this construct, there could be the potential for a public school to be designated as a choice school with a specialized program. And so,
Is
yeah,
that, I know this is a word that people get nervous about, but a public school that is a school choice school with perhaps a special program, is that basically a definition of a charter school?
Magnet school.
Magnet
be more
Magnus,
similar
that's what-
to,
Which is a public
Magnet.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Magnet
more similar
schools
to
in
a-
other states
yeah.
are like places where you have, engineering and STEAM and STEM or performing arts schools
Outdoors.
that meet, outdoor programming that meet sort of the specific interest of students. But I think a sort of foundational principle of what we're talking about here is that this choice system has to operate within a system where every student has access to a high quality public education. That's sort of the baseline foundational principle. Because as a basic principle, if that magnet school spot was not available or a choice school spot was not available, we have to ensure that that student still has access to a great public education. So that's a foundational principle that we're starting from. And then offering some additional options for students who may have different needs or interests.
So I'll flip my previous question to say that if you are operating a school district with public schools that have ample space for everybody, there is no need, you are not as a district, you're not required to approve any school choice school.
Says that you're required to
You are.
designate one.
You are.
within the proposal,
Everyone
yeah.
has school choice now.
Rob,
Yeah, I'm not sure how to articulate this because I guess I'm just a little not really sure about the detail here. So with the 4 academies, because these districts will now be much larger, will they still get to serve the public that they serve, or will they have to apply to be a choice school choice?
Everyone has to.
the historic
Well, there's-
academies now go through a process of approval to be an approved independent school. So it would be a process to be an approved school of choice. And there would not be an attendance boundary. It would be a lottery process, but with preference for those towns that have historically tuitioned to that school. And as part of that application process, there could be other preferences contemplated, such as a sibling preference, things like that, within the system.
Representative Brady.
Fundamentally, so currently we have choice in parts of the state. Fundamentally, this creates school choice statewide in every part of the state.
We have school choice throughout the state. Sometimes that choice is exercised from public school to public school. Sometimes that's with independent schools. So this is really structuring it as more of an intentional ecosystem where we can kind of, as a state, guarantee that there's access to a public school and also specialized opportunities for students to align to their interest. And that's really more thinking about in terms of scale. So when you think particularly at a high school level and you think within these attendance zones, there may not be enough students to run a pre-law program, for example, but there might be within the larger district. And so that's an opportunity where the school would not have necessarily a boundary for an attendance zone, but would be able to draw from a larger district of students that might be interested in that type of specialized program.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, so how does a student, by the attendance zones, a student, if every student fundamentally, by the principals here, needs to have access to a high quality public K-12, if you physically live somewhere where that does not exist within an hour, are we assuming there's also a building of several public schools throughout the state where they don't exist now, or how is that student assigned?
So as I've said, as we look at this proposal, we're designing this with kind of the statewide system in mind, and we're recognizing that there are some exceptions. So we've done some of that work. There's a couple of parts of our state where there may be exceptions in terms of access, and so that would be something that we would build in, and that would be part of a longer ramp.
If we end up in a future state where there's a lot of people moving.
Great.
We might contemplate the need to build a new school, but I think as we've articulated, it needs to be a practice. So there may be it's a few areas of the state where there might need to be some sort of exception.
Just as you pointed out, for areas of the state where we really rely on a school over the border.
Yes.
And just to clarify, and tell me if I'm saying this wrong, but within this is really to follow up on Rob's question about independent academies and whatnot. The state funding for an independent school that might charge a tuition is almost irrelevant because the foundation formula dollar is what you get for that student.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's the same, it's shared accountability and equity and funding in this model. So a lot of the details around the application process will be kind of determined, I think, through ongoing conversations. But another consideration that we indicated in the brief was a certain threshold in terms of number of students that receive public tuition, making it eligible to be a school of choice.
I think
So
we-
for example, if they only currently have 4 students out of 200, right? That's not meeting.
Did you open your hand?
No.
Oh, I thought you did. I'm sorry.
We can do another round here.
I'm happy. Great.
You're up. And Representative
Thank
Long.
you.
But you're
Just-
so excited to ask.
I'm just, no, I mean, well, of course, we're gonna all have
Yeah.
a ton of questions. I'm just, things keep popping up, and I sort of want to follow up on Representative Brady's question about school choice and students currently, what they currently have, what they will have. So currently, all students in the state of Vermont have access to 9-12 public school choice. I mean, we do know that we've done that. And then students in certain districts that don't operate a school for certain grades have choice of where to go. But there are a number of students in the state of Vermont, I have no idea, but a number of students in the state of Vermont who don't have access to choice now in the state, besides what I just named. So those students will now have access. So we will have a statewide school choice system now by lottery. And that, I think that statement is,
Yes, there'll be opportunities.
so every student in the state of Vermont will have choice by
Equitable
lottery.
opportunity.
I just wanted to clarify.
If spots are
Not
available.
not
Yeah, if spots
surprisingly,
are available.
That's what I
right?
said by
Yes,
lottery.
lottery. Yeah.
not surprisingly, this is a big issue. Okay, let me just go around for more questions before I wrap up with my final 2.
What are the budget assumptions of the elected part-time boards? Like how much do those boards cost? What does a part-time elected board member make? Are we talking like part-time of a professional salary? Are we talking, $3,000 stipend?
So let us get back to you with the specifics. If it's more than a stipend, that is typically allotted to traditional board work. But I want to make sure we've been kind of thinking through different scenarios. I want to come back to you with something more concrete.
And those are not baked into the base. Those are paid through
For the
another district funds that are not assumed in the per student spending. So there's a separate pot of like district money that is not.
Yeah. There's assumptions based on Yeah, there's assumptions based on funding at the district level to support the central office, and some of those dollars would go to the board members. So we'd be talking about 5 board members at a salary, a part-time salary. So it's not a huge hit on the budget, but that would be where that would come from.
I think I would really like to know what some of those specifics are, because there's a big difference between a small stipend and a part-time professional. If we're talking about part-time professional boards with exponentially more responsibilities here, but small
Yeah.
stipends.
I think we're
Very wide.
contemplating, we can tell you how other systems do this, and it's something that we've been talking about. In other systems, if you have a part-time board, they're paid a proportionate, would be a teaching salary, like a full. So that's an idea that we are contemplating, but as Zoe said, we can come back.
Do you mind? Oh, go.
All right, but
You- no,
related
keep going,
budget
please.
assumption
Please.
question.
Yeah.
And then what are the budget assumptions or the numbers for I have written down SAC school advisory committee, the sort of local on the
I
ground,
am.
keeping you connected to your community boards? Is there any funding?
Advisory council.
Thank you. School advisory councils, are those
At this point, we
funded?
had
Is that
not,
just?
at this point, we had not contemplated a stipend for the school advisory councils.
So my question, if it's okay, my question is on that same topic. I was quite struck by the fact that the building level principal will be overseeing the school advisory committees. Because that seems to me, and I could be wrong, but it's got a lot of duties and it seems to be a pretty big job. And because this is the school advisory committees are the liaison between the community, I guess, the community and the board. And that seems like a pretty big additional requirement on a building level principal who that's not needed. That's not what they do. It's not
I make a
part of the principal
distinction.
duty.
Yeah, that they're the connection between the community and the school. So they're advising on more of what they would see in terms of in the classroom and prioritization around programming in the school, not to the board. So that the connection is with the school. As we've noted in the brief, the school advisories may choose to organize into district advisories that might align with the feeding patterns to explore broader matters around education for students at different age bands within the smaller area of the district. And so that's just another opportunity for engagement and coordination.
Rep. Long, can you articulate if
Yeah.
we did not explain something?
I'm on that. So I'm on the PowerPoint, which is what and it just has I know you had, I don't know if you had a follow-up to this, but it's a big change.
School advisory committees.
Yeah.
I'm trying, it sounds wonderful in theory, and I think we all want more engagement in schools, but I'm trying to understand if you say it's very different than a PTA or something. It's an entirely volunteer organization that's just looking at their own school and has no power, no funds, and volunteer means probably people who are available during the workday. Like I'm struggling to see how that, other than on paper, is anything different than what it might exist right now in PTOs and other kind of parent organizations that.
It actually exists right now in merged districts under Act 46.
Some
And so if
have
you
them,
had some
many don't.
experience with this, she could actually articulate to help
Yeah,
folks
so-
envision how this actually works.
Yeah, so there would be more structure in terms of how they're organized. So they would be on a regular schedule. Typically once a month, they would have a standing time that's available for the community members to engage. They would have to follow some protocols around running the meetings, posting meeting minutes, and fulfilling their responsibilities assigned to that school advisory council. So they would need to document their involvement in reviewing, for example, the data around the school and being able to advise on goals and initiatives within the school improvement plan. Within this model, we're allocating kind of a portion of set aside within the budget for them to advise on kind of the allocation of that as part of our broader focus on equity and engagement in budgeting.
kind of two big questions that are not philosophical. One, this is enormous, including an enormous amount of statutory work that has to be involved here. Is there a status of sort of statutory language from the AOE to our ledge council to move that along? There's ETA on
Yes.
that?
Yeah, so our AOE legal counsel has been in touch with general counsel to the documents that we've provided. There's been translation into like legislative language. And so that's happened. I know that ledge counsel recently brought on an additional resource. And so now that that person is in place, that connection has been made.
So is there an ETA on that language for our legislative council?
So my understanding is that we were able to submit some language today, but I can coordinate all of them.
Yeah, getting some nods from people who may know more than I do. And I guess this is more of a statement than a question. So first of all, clearly a lot of thought went into this. It's very provocative, and we need provocative. You know, the end result when all is said and done may not be identical to this, but there's a lot here. Any educational transformation that sort of falls within this framework is really going to need a chief spokesman and salesperson, and that has to be the governor. And so my question is the governor going to be out there talking to Vermonters about this stuff? He's the one with the political capital. He's the one who has proposed this. Is that part of the plan?
So the governor spoke about the education transformation proposal yesterday in his press conference. And it's really important to him that we can continue to share many elements of this proposal. Something he's also been really consistent about is that we know that there's going to be additional, feedback and conversation that needs to happen. This proposal, as I've said before, really does come with a call to action of working together. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of thought that we put into this proposal. It is very transformative, and we need to make sure that we're incorporating feedback that's going to make this work and to work well. I think one of the principles that we approach to this work is really stepping back and thinking about how we would strengthen our system by doing some work around redesigning it. And so as opposed to kind of building upon some of the existing structure. And so I think that's where a lot of the questions are coming, is what does that transition look like? But I think the principles of this are really about building a very strong education ecosystem. We often talk about education ecosystem in Vermont. This is a time for us to really be concrete and strengthening that to ensure that we really have an excellent public education system and can guarantee that access. One thing I haven't noted as well, and is in the report, is that this structure also supports us as a state in getting in compliance with some of the areas where we've been in needs assistance for special education. And so that's another explicit goal around this to make sure that we can kind of deliver on that consistency of education across the state. And so the ability to create those assignments to public schools and have that greater clarity around the education ecosystem will be really helpful for us in delivering on equity and consistency. But I think to your core question, the governor is communicating this. He talked about it in the whole press conference yesterday, and is continuing to do that.
Thank you. And I will just change it from a question to a statement and just say that even transformation that is a fraction of what is being proposed here needs somebody at the head meeting Vermonters where they are, talking about why it has to happen. And in my opinion, that person currently needs to be our governor. And I'll leave it at that. That's not your responsibility to make sure it happens, but that's just, anyway, I just want to make that statement. And we look forward to hearing much more. And I will just ask about hearing much more. We got a couple pieces still missing to kind of hear about CTE and pre-K. I assume that's TBD. Oh, and you are, yes. And I will,
Pre-K is being
just-
scheduled. I think pre-K may have been scheduled for next Thursday, if I'm not mistaken. I know there was.
Yes, we are hearing the pre-K report that, study committee next week. And I do just want to clarify, we don't see anything here yet about school construction. Can we safely assume that that is still, that needs to be filled?
Yeah,
I
so
think
the.
Yeah, go ahead, Zoe. I mean,
I was just gonna say that at our last meeting, I noted that that's an area where we need to have some follow-up, but I have not had the opportunity yet to go any further since our last meeting.
Sure.
I will share that we also had that conversation with the Senate Education Committee as well. So this is on our radar and as a takeaway to be able to come back and talk about where this fits within the multi-year approach.
and we know that you're having some
Yeah.
conversations as well, and what are the creative solutions? I think that we do have consensus, and we have had for 2 years about the fact that we need to be very strategic, right, in the use of funds. And so I think that the question really seems to be centered around the timing and the funding, right? And so, as you all are having those conversations, if you're surfacing those ideas, we really do want to collaborate with you on those. It's a really hard nut to crack, but we've been working on it together successfully, I think, for 2 years.
Successfully, but with the exception of the money. We'll
It
get there.
doesn't grow
We'll
on
get there.
trees, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you very much for your time and for the proposal and for the backup materials. Look forward to seeing legislative language. There's a lot here for us to digest, and we will certainly be following up. Again, really appreciate the time.
And we're happy to come back and do just as we did with the funding,
need
give
that.
you the soak time
Yeah.
and surface those questions and.
Thank Thank you very much. That will undoubtedly be necessary. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
All right,
Thank you.
we'll hold there and just give everybody a chance to breathe, stretch before we're on the floor.